The idea of having secret cars in a Gran Turismo game is really nothing new. Especially in the older games from, say, 1 through 4 in particular, there were plenty of them. A lot of them, in fact, in some cases, and they ranged from just special paint colours to sometimes entirely hidden vehicles, and they were, in often cases, very, very cool. It's not so much something which happens anymore, though, and more recently the equivalent to that would be stuff like the leaked data mining list in GT7, those vehicles which we're still seeing gradually ticked off as each update arrives, giving it more and more credibility to the point where now you really can't doubt the list anymore, even if you were a denier to begin with. Likewise with the circuits. So the concept of having these hidden lists or hidden vehicles has always been an intrinsic part of Gran Turismo. This particular occasion though, we're talking about GT6. Why GT6? It's not really that relevant surely anymore. Well, of course I've always liked to look back at older games in the series, be it Gran Turismo or Forza, and because it's been quite some time since I last talked about Gran Turismo 6, but myself included, there are still plenty of us on the channel who enjoy the game, and it's really how the channel got started, so it's appropriate to look back at it. This is something which I was not aware of until very recently, and that is a not leaked list in this sense, but an unused content list that is still present in the game in its title form. Now these are not vehicles, as far as we can tell, that you can like find in the game or hack out of the game. They're just unused content that was left over in terms of coding of just the titles, but I think it's interesting to see what could have been or what some of the intentions were, and 1 or 2 of these I actually find quite fascinating. Vehicles which probably won't ever come back but could perhaps inspire future vehicles, and one of them in particular certainly already has. Now kicking off first of all is actually a NASCAR, a fictional variation of a NASCAR, a Toyota Camry in particular, 2010 shape, the GameStop liveried car, which I believe was in GT5. I'd never used the car myself. It was still present in title form in GT6, but wasn't featured. The next one is a more interesting one because it's a prototype version, and of course you can find all of these on the wiki, the fandom wiki for Gran Turismo 6 in the car list if you want to check it out, but it's a 2014 shaped Corvette, so the C7 Stingray, but it's the final prototype version. And of course, even in GT6 we had a couple of different versions. There was the Black Mask version. This one was kind of what they did with the Nissan GTR, having those multiple variations. The fact that this wasn't featured in the game I don't think matters too much, being a prototype, but of course it would have fit in very well in the game because they did have, as mentioned, so many of these different variations of certain cars, like the Corvette C7, like the R35 GTR. The next one is another Chevy. It's a Camaro SS quote-unquote Edge Special, and this one was more of a car that was kind of a marketing thing. It had a tie-in with a company who make personal care products, and it was kind of one of those stealth style cars, as you can see from the visuals, but just without the matte black. Aside from that, it's very similar to one of the stealth or the chrome line cars. Not a hugely important one there, but yeah. The next one is, well, in fact the next 2 are much more interesting, and this really would have been much cooler if it had been continued, probably not for licensing reasons on this particular occasion. Both of the Ferrari Formula 1 cars are still present in title form in Gran Turismo 6, the F10 and the F2007. Of course, fantastic cars in Gran Turismo 5. I personally really wish that these had been carried over, because if you think about it, we had a couple of really good Formula cars in Gran Turismo 6 in the form of the Formula Gran Turismo, which of course was in a bunch of different games, was originally the Polyphony 001s and the 002s, then it evolved into the FGT. Fantastic Formula car, probably the best one all round. And then of course we had the addition of Senna's Lotus, the 97T, a real-world Grand Prix car. This pair would have been not only a great continuation from GT5, but also a fantastic rounding out of yet more real-world Grand Prix cars. Because although most of Gran Turismo's Formula cars are definitely inspired by real ones, they don't tend to carry the real names. Again, for mostly licensing reasons, and we can say for almost a certainty that's probably why they didn't arrive in the game, which is a shame. The next one is a car which really I don't care wasn't featured, because this is very much a remnant of like the Gran Turismo 4 days, and it was the no stripe version of the Ford GT. Who really cares, you know? These kind of things became irrelevant as soon as you could change paint colours on cars, because for those who didn't play the older games, this is a radical idea, but from Gran Turismo 4 backward, you couldn't change the paint on the car. Whatever colour you bought it in, that was it. So if you wanted a different colour, you had to buy a different car, which is kind of crazy to think of now, but that actually created an environment in the game which made special colours actually feel like they mean something, which is so weird because now you can just put a livery on any car and it's completely destroyed the notion of unique liveries being all that special. Polyphony still sneaks those in here and there, like stealth cars or test versions, and although there are some differences, it definitely has remnants of that. But the Ford was just one of those. You know, it had no stripes. Big whoop, who really cares? You know, in the later games, they just merged it by having the paint colour option, which is a natural choice, and I really think that was a good idea to get rid of that one. It was pointless, there was no need to have it in the game. The next two for me are easily the two of the entire list which I really wish had been included. One of the relatively, in fact two of the relatively few cars in Gran Turismo 5 that I've done reviews for, the Ginetta G4 and the Jensen Interceptor. Two great classic British cars on total opposite ends of the spectrum. The tiny little Ginetta looks almost like a shrunken Shelby Cobra. And then, of course, the Jensen Interceptor with that huge Chrysler engine, basically a British muscle car meets GT car, hugely historically important car for the British performance car industry. And it is such a shame to me that both of these were discontinued from the game. Again, probably for licensing reasons, I would imagine. But yeah, it's a shame. The fact that they were still there in title form shows that at least to some degree they may have intended to have them brought back. I could see something like the Jensen Interceptor perhaps having like a premium update in a future Gran Turismo game, like a Gran Turismo 8 or maybe even 7. I don't think it's extremely likely or even high on their priority list, but I could kind of see that happening. If it did happen, it wouldn't surprise me. And I think it would be pretty cool if it did happen, because it was a beast of a car, even though a lot of players didn't use it, and it's definitely the two that to me stand out the most. The next one is another car which was kind of just merged, the Lotus Europa Special. This was the 71 shape car, which many of us will remember fondly. They basically just merged this one instead and had the 72 shape from then on. So this, much like the Ford, to me is not a car that was that essential. Sure, they could have had it again, but I don't really feel like I missed the car overall. The next one is another limited edition car, another Nissan, of course, a 350Z. There's not too much to say about this one. In fact, there are a number of different Z cars featured in the coding, mostly Academy cars. Some of them don't have associated pictures on the wiki, so we've got a 2012 shape, a 2013 shape. There is a quote-unquote tuned Academy car from 2008, which there is this image of. There's also a 2010, 2012, 2013, and there are also Black Edition GTRs tuned for the Academy as well. So all these kind of Academy cars, I mean, that's fine, you know, you can do away with those. And even if they were to bring them back, you really wouldn't need every single year. Although with Polyphony padding the numbers as they do, I'm surprised that they didn't bring these back, because of course there was no shortage of GTRs in the game, that's for sure. There were also Spec V versions, but you get the idea. It was all different Academy cars from different Academy years. And in spirit, at least, that kind of thing does still continue with the actual events. But I do find it curious that those event vehicles aren't trickled down into the game itself for all players to buy as much as they used to be. Like, these cars used to come down and be available to purchase, not so much anymore. You'll occasionally win like a special livery of a Red Bull, but it doesn't happen anywhere near as much as it used to. There are also, interestingly, a couple of Academy versions of the Nissan Leaf from 2012 and 2013 as well. There's one which I actually would have quite liked to try out, a Nissan March, a 125R GT, or GT Academy version, which could have been quite a cool little cop car kind of inclusion in the game. There are also a couple of Academy versions to continue on the list even more of Skylines and Silvias. There are 2012 and 2002 versions of the Silvia, the S15 shape in particular, GT Academy cars, and also Skyline GTRs. It's not listed on the wiki whether or not they were R34s, but I'm going to assume that they are, because one of them is listed as a Spec 2 NUR, the V-Spec, so I think they are R34s, 2012 shape on both, which doesn't really apply to an R34, but again, that's clearly what it is. Then we get to a car which I find very interesting. It's a Red Bull, a version of the X2010 called the 5G. Now this one I had never heard of, and it is a significantly detuned version of the Red Bull, and it was going to be for a Japanese-only championship. around 2012, and it was going to happen, of course, in the game. Drastically reduced horsepower, 385 horses, still 545 kilos, so super light, but no way near the kind of power, and a much lower performance level as well, 602 points, so super low for a Red Bull. Its RPM level is also significantly lower, it has a slightly revised aero package, and probably most notably, and this is the one thing which I find quite interesting because hints of this have been brought over into newer games like 7, the fan system is disabled. That was something which, as I recall, no other versions at the time had until the 2014 came along, and that is a concept which we have seen continued, until now in fact, because the newest versions of the Red Bulls still have that fan system disabled for those competitive events, which is understandable. You know, they don't want it to look absolutely ridiculous with these cars buzzing around the track with perfect grip. So that is something which I find interesting that was definitely carried over in spirit. But I really would love to get my hands on this car. It would have been very cool to drive an X2010 with so little power and a much more raw experience, and especially in career mode. I mean, imagine a 600-point Red Bull. That thing would have demolished every event that you could use it in. And then there's a car that's listed as the X2010 JP flag colour, which I'm assuming is probably a variation of that 5G car, or perhaps just a special livery of the normal X2010. Now, where things get especially interesting is where the list continues, because not only were these vehicles kind of almost carried over from Gran Turismo 4 or 5, but there were also some vehicles which would have been debuts, legitimately new cars, including the very first one on this part of the list, a car which we now have. This one could have arrived, and evidence was there in, the entry of the database of the game, the Ferrari 500 Mondial, which of course we now do have in Gran Turismo 7. So that was initially slated for a Gran Turismo 6 inclusion, but then for whatever reason wasn't. That one's a fascinating one to me. The next one would have certainly appealed to the livery creators now in Gran Turismo Sport and 7 interested, because it was a Hatsune Miku liveried BMW, I believe Z3 GSR race car, a 2012 shape, which would have been a fascinating one. There's no accompanying picture for that one, but you can Google it and find the car. I'll probably slap an image in there. That would have been a curious addition, certainly unlike any other special livery in the game. There was also a proposed base model for a couple of different race cars, including the Audi R18, the Audi R8 LMS, and curiously, the Audi Quattro, the rally car, and there are thumbnails included as well as just the titles for these ones to be included. I find this one interesting because sometimes these base model cars, especially in Gran Turismo 6, would end up being better than the actual full livery versions. I think the most notable example, at least that I can recall, was the Peugeot 908, because the base model of that car was more powerful and I believe it was notably faster as well than the actual full liveried car. So these could have been interesting, especially to me. That rally version could have potentially been quite different in terms of the specs. We don't know that for a fact, but I would be very curious to have seen that. The next two are basically just paint variations for both the Red Bull Junior and the Red Bull Racing Karts, so nothing particularly special there. The next one though is another fascinating one, and this is one which I remember even talking about at the time, the Hyundai N, the Vision GT, because of course we saw this. We literally saw the Hyundai N 2025 and the Bugatti, but they never arrived in GT6. There were even images of these cars, I may even be able to find one, of it at Monaco in the game. So clearly it was almost ready to go, at least enough for a photo mode op, if not to actually be drivable, but of course they pushed it forward to Gran Turismo Sport instead. I believe they did that to make that game more desirable, rather than putting them in this game at the last minute and then just having them as carryovers. But it is, of course, a part of the game. It was removed after a certain update from the files, but clearly it was originally planned for inclusion. The next one is another car which was only available on certain versions of the game in certain countries for a very short time at particular events, and that was the Toyota SFR, the 2015 shape. This one again had a later inclusion, was planned then, but then ultimately didn't happen. And the last one, this one's actually probably the most fascinating of this list, at least on par with the Ferrari 500 being potentially planned for inclusion, but this one even more so. I'd never known that they'd gotten far enough to give this car a name, but it's the Alfa Romeo Vision GT. The Alfa Romeo 6C Biposto Vision Gran Turismo. This car was planned for inclusion. It had a title in the list of the game, and of course there was concept art for all of the Vision GTs, or pretty much all of them. There were a couple that didn't, in the Vision GT section of the game, and there is still concept art on Google. Alfa Romeo pulled out of the Vision GT program, but I find it very odd that they pulled out of the program when they'd clearly already gotten to the point of having concept art and even given the car a name, which to me indicates surely there must be at least a partially digitized concept of what that car could have been. You wouldn't just draw some pictures, make up a name, and then leave it at that, surely. And if it was just that, why would Polyphony have ever given the car a title in the game? Clearly they must have gotten to a certain point where that car having that title and that being the finalised name must have meant something. So that one I find fascinating. I really would have been interested to see what that could have turned out like. But overall, that's it for the probably even more interesting little list of vehicles that could have been brand new to the game, some of which, like the Ferrari, we of course currently have, and also the cars which were unfortunately discontinued from previous games. But overall, that's it for the list. Of course, tell me your thoughts down below on the ones which you found the most fascinating, and of course stick around mostly now for Gran Turismo 7 content on the channel, but occasionally for older games as well, such as this one. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.